Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 72. Have you been hearing about the popular framework FastAPI? An application programming interface, API, is vital to make your software accessible to users across the internet. And FastAPI is a great choice for quickly creating a web API that implements best practices. This week on the show, David Amos is back, and he's brought another batch of PyCoder's Weekly articles and projects. We share an introduction to FastAPI written by the framework's author, Sebastián Ramírez. The goal behind the article is to get you started creating production-ready APIs. David covers an article about the Python import system and how it remains a mystery for many Python developers. We share some additional real Python resources on the import system and statements. We cover several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a buffet of specialized data types with Python's collections module, maps with Django using GeoDjango, PostGIS, and Leaflet, moving SciPy to the Meson build system, what's new in Python 3.11, a community-maintained Python framework for creating mathematical animations, and easily make PDFs with pdfme. This episode is brought to you by Sentry, helping developers see issues that matter, solve those issues in minutes, and learn insights to keep their applications running at peak performance. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, David, welcome back.
Hey, Chris. Thanks for having me.
All right, so we got a nice collection of PyCoder stuff this week.
Yeah.
And a couple real Python things in there, as usual.
For sure.
And I'm kind of excited to get rolling. So what do you got?
First one comes from our good friend Leodanis Pozo Ramos. It's Python's collections, a buffet of specialized data types. And we've talked about the collections module several times on the podcast. I think even recently, the last couple of times we've done a podcast together. So the collections module includes things like name tuple, which I believe we've talked about, the default dict, and the counter class, which we may have even talked about was the last time that I was on, or maybe the time before that. This article is really just kind of an overview of what's inside the whole collections module, as opposed to, kind of a deep dive on individual things, and kind of ties together everything that has been put out recently on these other data structures. But it also goes into some things that we don't have articles on currently, and things that we haven't talked about on the podcast. It mentions, the motivation behind the collections module and why you would want to learn it, learning how to write more Pythonic code and leverage these built-in data structures that are there for you. So it gives you a quick overview and talks about things like the deck, which is double-ended queue, which is a really great one to be aware of. The default dict, the name tuple. I guess I could describe what some of these things are. Like default dict it's a way to associate like a specific type or data structure for any key. Like all keys would have kind of the same type, like a list or a set or something along those lines. And it gives you a way to, like, if you try to do something with a key that doesn't exist yet, you've got like a default there that it'll start with, some kind of empty collection of that, whatever that default is, or whatever the type is that you have assigned to it. And you can write some really clean code that way. So it talks about that. The name tuple, which we've mentioned, which is one of my favorites in the collections module, a way to give names to the components of a tuple, like the slots in it, which is really handy. And then you can access them with like the dot notation. So you could actually have a tuple, an immutable tuple data structure that not only could you access by components by index, but you could do like maybe it represents like a row in a database table where you've got, people and you've got first name and last name, and you can actually have those names associated to that and do, dot first name, dot last name to get those.
Yeah, I think that's such a really powerful thing to return, from a function, to have all that kind of extra control.
Yeah, exactly. And so for each of these, it mentions good examples of use cases for this. And that's actually one of the ones for the name tuple is, as a return value for something you've read a CSV file or read something from a database, and you're going to return a record or multiple records in a list or something. And you can use the name tuple like that to give a little bit more friendlier API on that, on what you get back from that function. It gets into the ordered dict, which I think we've talked about some as well, and the counter, which we've talked about.
Yeah, we did that one last time. Yeah.
Yeah. And something called the chain map, which is like a dictionary-like class that allows treating a number of mappings as a single dictionary object. So it's sort of like if you have several dictionaries that you need to maybe say iterate over those dictionaries all together, you don't need to do any sort of like complicated dictionary unions or merging or things like that. You can use this chain map to sort of chain them all together in a way and loop over that. So that's a really neat one. And then it also talks about some of these maybe unusual sounding classes that are in collections called user dict, user list, and user string. And so these are wrapper classes around the built-in dictionary, list, and string objects that are really meant, like if you're going to create your own kind of custom dictionary, rather than say subclassing from the built-in dict type, you would subclass from user dict. You can argue whether or not you would want to do something like that, or do something more like composition. Like I think we've talked about kind of the composition versus inheritance thing on here, but those are, I think, kind of little known features of collections, or that you may not even be aware that these things exist in Python at all. So the article just gives you a good overview of everything that's available and kind of a quick examples of how you can use these. And then we've got several articles here on Real Python that do deep dives into these things.
Yeah, much deeper.
So you can kind of continue learning by clicking through to those for the ones that you're most interested in. So definitely a good one to check out, because I think collections is one of those things that it really kind of takes your Python programming to the next level once you learn how to use everything that's in there.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the test questions and that database of stuff that we found, the GitHub types of interview questions. And again, you can kind of do it sometimes the longer way with just base Python without kind of importing, stuff from the collections module.
Right.
But then this can really speed it all up and make it look a lot cleaner, and potentially add a lot of additional methods and stuff to just really make things much more functional in a kind of nice, useful way.
Yeah, and potentially more performant as well.
Yeah. Right. If it's written down at that C layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Being ready to go. Yeah, cool. Awesome.
What you got?
So my first one is an article by Paolo Melchiorre. It's Italian, so I'm not sure if I got that pronounced exactly right, but it's a second part of a series he's doing that's called Maps with Django. And this one is focusing with it's hard to say, GeoDjango, PostGIS, and Leaflet. And Leaflet is a JavaScript library that is super, super lightweight for doing mapping. And then the GeoDjango and the PostGIS is adding all those kind of coordinate-based libraries to, well, the Django part of it is helping you with, the whole model structure and talking to databases and connecting all that. And then this PostGIS is kind of this additional layer to help get the GIS information inside there. And it's a guide. I would have to say that it's optimized for running on Linux. He's much more of a Linux kind of based guy. I was having some struggles getting it all set up inside my Mac, but I was impressed by just the set of instructions that you need to get started and going is actually pretty quick.
Yeah.
The types of templates that you need to build are, pretty small. And similarly, the type of information you have to build into your models. Django has built a lot of this stuff in. It really has all these connections with this GeoDjango module built in, ready to go. And so if you're interested in doing mapping, web-based stuff with Python, and again, you want to have it out there as a project, I think this would be a really good starting point for you to kind of get you going. He covers quite a few of the, just kind of getting things set up, all the base Django, build your Django project and virtual environment and that sort of stuff. And then it gets into, creating the static files, and then eventually getting up when you add that JavaScript library for Leaflet, you suddenly then, very quickly have this Leaflet map of the entire world, which is really cool. And then it dives deep into GeoDjango and this thing called GDAL, and getting that installed, wiring it up. Eventually you wire as a backend instead of the sort of default of a SQLite database, which is kind of the Django like wired in default. You modify it to talk to Postgres.
Yeah.
And so the Postgres SQL, and that uses the psychopg2 binary package. So you're adding that. And so it really is kind of a nice project to kind of get you going in that direction. I'll share a real Python article and course that covers the same stuff. So I'll include links for that we had from a couple of years back by Ahmed Bouchefra. That one's called Make a Location-Based Web App with Django and GeoDjango. So that's another resource for you if you're interested in diving into that. And then Jackie Wilson made a video course for it also. So lots of stuff to kind of check out there if you're interested in playing around with PostGIS and Django and, mapping.
Yeah, and it looks like Paulo has some plans for some, to continue the series.
Yeah.
I saw at the end of the article, he talks about future articles. He's going to talk about, so in this article, you basically create like a set of markers on the map. So like little pins at specific locations. And he's going to get into like filtering that data and adding like pop-ups to those kinds of things, how to cluster markers to make loading data more efficient, and using geocoding services to add marker locations starting from an address and things like that. So yeah, if you're interested in this, it sounds like a good series to follow along with and stay up to date on.
This is only part 2, I guess. Let's see how many articles it takes to add all that additional stuff.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it literally has stay tuned at the end, which is great. So what's your next one?
Next one is kind of, I guess, more of a kind of a news announcement, and also something to think about if you are a package maintainer that has to build, create builds of your package for distribution. One thing that somehow I had missed, and I'm not sure how I missed this, or maybe I knew about it at one point and then forgot about it. In Python, for a long history now, if you need to build like a distribution or something, a distributable for your package, you use the distutils module. And that's been the way it's done for quite a while. However, packaging ecosystem has been undergoing quite a bit of changes over the last few years, and things are really kind of starting to ramp up with that. And in Python 3.10, which will be released this coming October of 2021, the distutils the distutils module will be deprecated. And in Python 3.12, the plan is to remove it altogether. So packages that rely on distutils only have a couple more years before they really, you've got to do something about it. You've got to figure out a new build system. And this article is called Moving SciPy to the Meson Build System. It's written by Ralph Gommers. And SciPy uses actually not the distutils that comes with Python, but a kind of an extension to distutils that is inside of the NumPy library. And so they use NumPy distutils, and that directly depends on the built-in distutils and also the setup tools as part of its build system. So the removal of distutils is going to have a pretty major impact on SciPy. And the maintainers have already, before 3.10 is even out here, they've already started looking at, what are we going to do to move forward with this? How are we going to handle our builds? And they basically narrowed it down to 2 choices. There's the CMake tool, which if you're on Linux, you probably have had some experience with this. The other option is something called Meson. And after some experimentation, Ralph says he had a strong preference for Meson for a couple of different reasons. One, it has really great documentation, which he says is unlike CMake, and it's easy to contribute to. It's only, I say only, it's about 25,000 lines of pure Python code compared to about 1 million lines of C and C++ for CMake. So if if you have a feature that you need and you want to contribute to that, you're only talking about handling, well, it's pure Python first of all, and it's a much smaller code base, so it's easier to kind of digest and understand.
Right.
And then on top of that, he explores some of the benefits he found in his experimentation. The biggest one being that Meson is incredibly fast. And he gives some statistics here showing that, with the current NumPy distutils based build, building all of SciPy takes about 7 minutes to build. But the Meson build takes about a little under 4 seconds. So it's a pretty massive speed up and build. So that's really cool. That's going to save a lot of time. It offers some better debugging tools, and he gives some examples of that and how that's going to help them. Talks about how cross-compiling is going to become possible, that for years they've had to tell people, sorry, distutils wasn't really made for cross-compiling. Let us know if you have any luck, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But now they'll be able to support more architectures, and Meson makes that a lot simpler for them. Meson allows developers to use multiple builds at the same time, and it comes with more development tools out of the box. And kind of going back to the code base thing, build definitions are easier to understand and modify. So, although he does say not everything was easier, but a lot of the common tasks that they have to do definitely were. So there's just a lot of benefits. Ralph describes some of the key Meson design principles and things that he liked about it. And then also mentions, that not everything was smooth sailing. And he has a section called the sharp bits. And so he has kind of a collection of 4 things that of kind of pain points that he found while doing it. But basically, the benefits that they are going to get from Meson far outweigh these pain points. And so they've basically decided this is probably the direction they're going to go. Right now, Ralph has a fork of SciPy that he's been experimenting with using these Meson builds. And they're going to start working on incorporating that into, upstream on the main repository. So if you're a package maintainer and you're worried about this distutils removal in a couple of years, then highly suggest you check this out and maybe start experimenting with Meson yourself and see what kind of benefits that offers your own project.
Yeah, that's good. I think going forward, there's only going to be, more types of hardware platforms, with the way Apple's kind of moving with like their M1 architecture.
Yeah.
And it looks like maybe Windows is, trying to run on ARM, and then there's,
right.
Like a lot of different other manufacturers there. So having these other build systems is probably going to be, or having, one that can support multiple platforms is
going to be
is good. And the speed sounds like that's a huge benefit. So that's nice. So this episode is brought to you by Sentry, helping developers see issues that matter, solve those issues in minutes, and learn insights to keep their applications running at peak performance. What can you expect from Sentry? You get actionable insights and full context so you can fix your app's errors and optimize its performance. You get performance monitoring. Engineering managers and developers now have a single tool to trace Python performance issues back to poor performing API calls, as well as surface all related code errors. And with Sentry's error monitoring, you can understand the important events that led to each Python exception, be it SQL queries, debug logs, network requests, or past errors. Spend less time fixing bugs and more time building features. You can learn more at sentry.io/for/Python and sign up with the promo code RealPython. That's all caps RealPython to get 3 free months of Sentry's team plan. My next one is titled What's New in Python 3.11? And you might be thinking 3.11. 3.10 is still in beta. You're right. It's still on, track to come out here this fall. But they're working on Python 3.11 already. Python 3.10 is locked as far as features, but 3.11 is, they're still working through what they think should be included and added. And I recently had this conversation with Joanna, if you didn't check it out, about the Python Language Summit. And so there's a lot of those kind of ideas are being tossed around to, what are we going to do in Python's future? And so I don't really per se want to go point by point through this because it's actually fairly short.
Yeah.
I think more I'd like people to be aware that this is a resource for you to get a heads up, and it's a placeholder to, it'll be updated and you could come back to it and say, okay, well, what is new? What's getting changed and modified? And as they add more things. So one of the first ones is something that we discussed already a little bit, where PEP 657 is starting to get implemented, which is adding these error locations and tracebacks and giving you the little carets and things underlining or pointing to the portions of the statements or expressions that are probably to blame for these things.
Yeah.
Which is really cool. And it shows that more than like the couple examples that we were pointing to those Twitter things a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Like they have an example of a 0 division error, and it gives a heads up to which variable is probably causing this.
Right. Yeah.
Which is really great. And so again, the idea of being able to locate the errors, to have improved tracebacks, to have all that kind of information be much more, revealed, is really going to make things, I think, better and really improve the experience of using Python moving forward.
Absolutely.
The other big changes, as far as new modules, they don't have any yet. Improved modules. You had noted in the PyCoders thing that there's some stuff added to math, and some additions to fractions. The OS module, they're changing out which sort of cryptography thing it's using.
Yeah.
It's using now bcrypt, which is good. Some changes to SQLite. They're removing some stuff, which is also something that was discussed in those talks as far as the Python Language Summit, like this SMTP method for this thing called mailman proxy.
Yeah.
It requires an external module anyway, so it doesn't make sense per se to have that like wired in and needing to be updated all the time as part of the language. So
right.
Those are great optimizations. And again, you can kind of look at these things, and I think it's always good to have an idea of where things are headed, and they have sections on porting your code across, what things potentially are going to be deprecated, like some of the conversations that we just talked about with things like dist utils. So anyway, I think it's a nice placeholder. Keep your eye on it and maybe check on what's happening there. And I think this will be good going forward as we move from 3.11 and 3.12 or whatever, as how far we go up from there.
Yeah.
Especially with this sort of yearly scheduled system now that's becoming pretty regular. It's a good place to keep an eye on.
Yeah, for sure. And I really I like that, kind of a theme I've noticed. Well, the release manager on 3.11 is the same release manager for 3.10.
Yeah, Pablo Galindo.
Galindo, yeah. And I'm not sure if he's also going to be the release manager for 3.0. But I've noticed a theme, by following him on Twitter and seeing, what he's discussing there and everything, is that really there's just so many user experience improvements that are coming in 3.10 and also now it looks like in 3.11. And I'm just excited to see that, because I think that's an area where there are some real pain points for beginners. We talk about Python being such a great language for beginners, and it is,
right?
But there are still some pain points, and a lot of those have to do with, errors and tracebacks and things like that. And so it's just really great to see a lot of effort actually going into really trying to improve that. And that's one of those things that, like, beginners experience these very quickly.
Yeah.
But it affects experienced developers as well. Like,
true, right?
These are like true benefits for, like, no matter what level you're at, just
across the spectrum. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just really great to see that taking place.
Yeah, I'm excited by it. The releases are definitely in good hands, and if anything, to me, as somebody who again is sort of an intermediate person in this whole thing, I feel like this is yet another form of documentation that is getting improved every time I kind of come back to look at these things, which is great.
Yeah,
cool. So, what's your next one?
The next one I've got comes from a blog called 10,000 Meters, and the author is Viktor Skvortsov, and we've featured several of his articles in this Python Behind the Scenes series in PyCoders, and maybe we've talked about one or two of them as well here on the podcast. He's up to number 11 now, so it's been quite an extensive series. And this one is all about how the Python import system works. And I found it kind of funny. His blog is called 10,000 meters, which sort of suggests that like you're taking this sort of like high level view of things, right? Like,
yeah, I think the US centric one is 10,000 feet view.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah. And this would be much higher.
It would be, that's true. Yeah. However, this feels like, 10, nanometers. Like it's really like kind of zoomed in and focused. Yeah. Like exploring things in a lot of depth. And so the imports, he starts by saying, if you ask me to name the most misunderstood aspect of Python, I will answer without a second thought, the Python import system. And I think I kind of agree with that. In my own journey, it was sort of like I learned how to import a module or a package. And then that was kind of it. Like I didn't really think too much more about it until I needed to, which kind of came much later in my Python career. And you start to realize that like, wow, there's a lot going on there that is kind of happening behind the scenes and isn't exposed in the code. And it can create some interesting and very confusing issues for people, because I think every Python developer has at some point been doing something and you're working, you've got the package installed, and then you go to run your program and you get an import error. And it's like, what? Like, no, this is installed. Like, why can't you find this thing? Or you get an import error about, trying to do some kind of relative import and there's no known parent package for it or things. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like there is, like, I'm looking at it and that is where, these misunderstandings or just not having the kind of like in-depth knowledge of how the import system really works can bite you and become kind of a pain.
Yeah.
And so Victor talks about, kind of starts at the beginning, like, here's just a simple import statement, and talks about, what's actually going on kind of behind the scenes. He takes a look at some of the CPython code, even the byte code and things like that, just to kind of get a sense for like, okay, this is what happens when you type an import. He talks about different kinds of modules. And again, that's something that if you're just starting out with Python, you probably think of, it's a module's a module, right? Like I create a Python file and then put some functions in it, and then I can import that. Well, there are many different kinds of modules, and they all have their own little idiosyncrasies. There's built-in modules, right, which just come built into the Python language. There's something called frozen modules. There's C extensions. There's the Python source code files, which is like the Python files that you create. The bytecode files, the PYC files, maybe you've seen those. Those are things that you can actually import and things like that. And then directories and packages, and there's so many different things that can be imported, and they all behave a little bit differently, and are handled differently internally and things like that. Sub packages and modules, things called regular packages, namespace packages. There's all sorts of things that you might not even be aware of. And so it kind of gives you this overview of like, okay, what are all the different kinds of things that you can import? What are all the different kinds of modules and packages? And then the different things you can do: wildcard imports, relative imports, absolute imports, running programs as modules, all sorts of stuff. So it gives you this really kind of high level overview of like the whole import thing, everything you can do with it. And then it really gets into some deep stuff and looking at the bytecode when you compile an import statement, and diving into the CPython source code itself to really examine the import process and how all of that works, to really give you a deeper understanding of what's going on. And it kind of near the end gives you a full discussion of, the path, the Python path and sys.path. And, maybe you've heard of these things or you've seen things about them and you don't know what that is. This really gives you a deep dive and deep understanding of what all that entails. And like when you say, hey, import this package called X, well, where is it going to actually find that? And in what order is it searching for things? And what happens if you have two modules named X somewhere and you've got this name collision? How does it resolve that? So yeah, it's really, it really is like very in depth and a deep dive into how all this works. So it's a good read. It is fairly long, but I think, it's a good place, to just get that kind of full picture. Obviously, you can go a lot deeper than this. You could probably write a book on just importing things in Python.
And Gerarna has tried.
Right, yeah. And so, yeah, we do have some resources on Real Python as well about how all this works. We have an article on absolute versus relative imports, and we've got an article on some kind of advanced tips and tricks on imports and things like that. So those don't get into all the details that this does. And there's things in those articles that are not discussed in this article. So if you really want to go on a deep dive, maybe start with this one from Victor and then branch off into what we've got on Real Python to kind of learn even more and that. So, but yeah, I just wanted to highlight it because it is something that I think is misunderstood, or that you probably or may not even realize that there's more to understand there. So, yeah.
I like the examples are mostly REPL type examples. So you're just kind of working inside there and trying things out, and not extremely in depth as far as like the steps you need to do to try the techniques out and kind of learn like, okay, well, that created this circular import. Well, why? And it shows that, which is really cool.
Yeah.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It covers the topic we touch on this week, and it's titled Python Modules and Packages, an Introduction. The course is based on a Real Python article by John Sturtz, and the instructor for the video course is me. And I'll show you what is a module, what is the module search path, how Python's dir function works, the how and why of reloading modules, executing a module as a script, what makes up a package, and how to work with sub-packages. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn how to work with Python modules and packages. So much of Python is done through importing and managing this process. And this is a solid introduction to the concepts. Real Python video courses are broken into easily consumable sections, and where needed include code examples for the techniques shown. All lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the newly enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So my next one is an article that I'm excited to talk about because I've been hearing so much about FastAPI for a long time. And it's by the creator of the library FastAPI, Sebastián Ramírez. And it's titled Using FastAPI to Build Python Web APIs. What I felt kind of initially was like, oh gosh, this is kind of a bit of a short guide. And I think mainly because it doesn't really require you to do a whole ton of work to get this going and running, which is really kind of nice. It was like, oh, that's it.
The beauty of FastAPI, yeah.
Hence the name, right?
Yeah.
And the setup of it is similar, in my opinion, to like setting up like a Flask app.
Yes.
Kind of quickly you could kind of just tie things together. The one addition is you're adding a library for async work, which is this thing called Uvicorn, which I've talked about a couple times with different people. Mm-hmm. This is a thing that works with Starlet, which is another library that's also very specifically asynchronous. And anyway, so as you start to set this up, you're installing it, setting up the basic kind of functionality, and then very quickly you're looking at responses and it kind of showing you as this thing's acting as an API. And then what's nice is it has built-in endpoints for documentation, which are beautiful.
Yes.
And very, very functional. And if you've used something like, I don't know, there's one I was talking about, but there's a thing called Postman, which was an API kind of tool I've used before, where you can kind of dabble back and forth and kind of figure out, is this a get? Is this a post? Is this, all these different kinds of things that you would normally do to talk to an API. You can kind of try them out. And this has a very similar feel. And then it shows you the types of responses you would get and how things are defined. And as you expand, the idea, I think one of the primary benefits of the library is its connection with this thing called Pydantic that we've talked about also, which is, handling the types, the specifically setting it up so that it's, strongly typed. And that way you are getting these benefits of knowing this is what it should be expecting, and then it will present actual errors to you, if a user is trying to hit the API in a certain way with the wrong types, and it'll explain that to the user and kind of show what's happening. And then the article goes through data conversion and then the data validation, and then again setting up things with structures where you're looking at kind of creating like a JSON data model, which they are calling a data shape.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a really quick guide. If you've heard about FastAPI and you're like, oh gosh, I don't have time to learn this new thing, I think you can maybe go through this whole thing in a half an hour and play through all the different examples and look at the documentation. The thing that I kind of wanted a little more from it is like, okay, well now let's implement it. Let's throw it into like a database and toss it back and forth. But you have everything you need, before that to kind of get going. And I think the documentation that comes with FastAPI does go to that next level. So you could kind of go into that with some tutorials there.
Yeah.
But it's the other neat thing that it shows is with this strong type checking kind of built into it, how the functionality inside of an IDE like a VS Code or a PyCharm or what have you, you get all this great auto completion and checks. And, as you're playing with the data models, it will say, no, you can't do that. This should be, a string or an integer or what have you. And it's, giving you heads up, which you may not get when you're just kind of dealing with, maybe a generic JSON kind of call or what have you to APIs. This is actually going to explicitly tell you through this checking system, which is, again, one of the big goals of the system.
Right.
So yeah, I was really impressed with, again, with the brevity that's involved and how fast you can kind of get going with it. And it definitely is piqued my interest to start playing with it a lot more. So yeah, I'm excited about sharing it and seeing what else he's developing as he keeps going, because it looks like this is like Sebastian's main focus.
Yeah.
Going forward. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason it's become so popular so fast.
Yeah.
It had the distinction of, on the last like JetBrains PSF, the Python developer survey, it was the third most, I forget the exact wording for it, but like third most popular web framework.
Mm-hmm.
That you had Django, Flask, and then, or maybe it was Flask and then Django, and then FastAPI, and it had a surprisingly high quote unquote market share of something like 12 or 13%, if I remember correctly. And it's like, I don't think it's even 2 years old.
Yeah.
Or maybe, it's like, it hasn't been around that long. So yeah, and, there's a reason for that. And I think, like you said, this article kind of highlights that and just how quickly you can get up and running it.
Yeah. And definitely, get in there and start playing around with the data. And like I said, the docs and this other redocs thing that's kind of built in is very, very handy for kind of playing with it. I mean, I've messed around with Django's kind of API features, and we have an article that kind of goes into this, but there's a lot more setup and models and all that kind of stuff. This is a much more streamlined in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Cool. I guess that brings us into projects.
Yeah.
It sounds like you are touching on a bit of a repeat project, at least
sort of
some interesting, some news there, which is cool.
Yeah. So a while ago, I featured a project called Manim, which is a really cool library for creating animations. And it was originally created by Grant Sanderson, who is better known as 3 Blue 1 Brown on YouTube. He's just an amazing math communicator and popularizer. I think that's the word.
Sure.
But he put together this Manim library for creating animations for his YouTube videos. It is kind of centered around like mathematical type animations, but you could use it for creating all sorts of animations just to like help like a visual aid for something you're trying to explain. And there is a new, within the last few months here, community maintained fork of manim, because one of the issues that Grant had was, he's not a professional Python developer. He's not he wasn't invested in really supporting manim a whole lot, or, it was kind of like he put it out there and, other people can kind of do what they want with it. And it really gained, a lot of popularity, but there, was a lot of lacking, it was lacking a lot of documentation, and some of the things would not necessarily be considered like best practices necessarily. So there's a community fork now under the GitHub project named Manim Community. And then it's still just manim. And I think they've even taken the PyPI, when you pip install manim, now you're getting the community version and not the original. So it's all kind of been passed over to that. And they've done a lot of, they've done a lot of work on the documentation, and they've done a lot of work on even the API and everything to make it a little bit more friendly and follow best practices, and the packaging behind it and everything. So anyways, it's just it's a neat project, and I'm happy to see that there's a community growing around it, and that there's some people that are really devoting their time to improving this and keeping it up to date and all that kind of stuff. So, and I'm sure Grant is very appreciative of that as well, because it's not like his main focus, right? Like he's really about communicating mathematics and not developing an animation library.
Nice.
Yeah.
That's totally up your alley too with the math animations.
Yeah.
Have you been working on creating some using it?
I've only kind of dipped my toes in the water, so to speak. I haven't really done anything too complicated with it. But yeah, now that there's, better documentation and everything, it's something I want to dive into more deeply and possibly even contribute to. They are asking for help with improving the docs and that kind of stuff. So maybe I'll end up contributing to it. We'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. So my project is in the PDF realm, which seems to be a bit of a theme for me also. And this one's called pdfme or pdfme. Subtitle is make PDFs easily. And it's by Andres Sierra, who's a software developer from Colombia. It's a nice little PDF library. It's actually very cool, the kinds of things that have been implemented into it. It has actually a pretty good PDF read the docs site with a tutorial diving you into it. And the primary idea behind pdfme is to just get you into creating PDFs without necessarily having to, speak the PDF document format language.
Right.
And this one is doing some of that heavy lifting for you. So you're almost sort of setting stuff up as it looks a little bit like JSON to me, or these kind of nested dictionaries of sections and headers and footers. And
yeah,
I don't know. I played around with it for a little bit here. It lets you do rich paragraphs, with fonts and colors and sizes and that whole rich text kind of looks and so forth. You can do tables, and that includes, formatting the tables with fills and borders and stuff. The area that I hadn't seen in some other libraries are these sort of content boxes where, if you think of like a magazine and how an article layout would potentially have these sections with multi-columns or images kind of embedded in there. So your PDF page document could have, this sort of breakout area that is like this content box, which I think is really slick and has like wrapping for that.
Yeah.
All the linking for like internal document linking with URLs is in there with, the color highlighting, get to pick all that sort of stuff. And then it, can link outside. Outlines, I think I already said headers and footers, but it's a neat library, and it's really looks like just sort of a starting point for what's going on with it. And so it's something I'm going to keep an eye on going forward. But yeah, so pdfme, and I went to Andres's GitHub, and he's actually doing some other fun kind of projects. He's got a tkinter forms thing called TK Data, which looks interesting. And then controlling music in your Raspberry Pi from any browser on the internet as another library. So
I know someone that's into that stuff.
Yeah, totally. So I'm very interested in those kinds of things. So yeah, so I'm going to follow Andres here and see where things go.
Neat. Yeah.
Well, we covered a lot of stuff in a little bit of time this time, and it's fun always to dive through all the PyCoder stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Yep. Thanks, Chris.
This episode was brought to you by Sentry, helping developers see issues that matter, solve those issues in minutes, and learn insights to keep their applications running at peak performance. You can learn more at sentry.io/4for/Python and sign up with the promo code RealPython. That's all caps RealPython to get 3 free months of Sentry's team plan. I want to thank David Amos for joining me again this week. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and look forward to talking to you soon.